Thank you for inviting me. And look, this is the situation 100 years ago. And what you see is it says suitable for children and adults. This was a lung tonic. So, and that was a cough killer. You don't know what was in this medication, but I can tell you it was opiates. So as sure as heaven, this killed the cough in children. And if the child was, and the mother was happy and lucky, it didn't kill the child. But many children were killed. So Professor van den Anker told us that up to 70% of the drugs today are used off-label in children. We go back to history. This was the label 100 years ago. And it was legal. So 100% of these drugs were used on-label in children. And my question is, was it better 100 years ago? And the answer is, they had a different understanding of what a label is. A label makes a claim. It says this drug can heal cancer. 100 years ago, you were allowed to do that even with just a pack of sugar. Things have changed. And why have they changed? Two reasons. One is potent drugs were developed. This is an example. Sulfanilamide, an antibiotic. Somebody thought a liquid sulfanilamide would be a good market. So they developed a liquid formulation in the US in 1937. And they used ethylene glycol as a solvent. It killed more than 100 people. And the crazy thing is the FDA existed already, but a medication that killed people was still legal. So they had no legal reason to withdraw the drug from the market because it was unsafe. So they had to find a legal loophole. And the legal loophole is here. It reads elixir. And I understand that there are many pharmacists here in the room. The American Pharmacopoeia said an elixir is defined by alcohol as a solvent. Now, would they have used alcohol? It would have been less dramatic. They used ethylene glycol, which is toxic. And so there was a wrong label on this medication. And that was the loophole for the FDA to seize the entire production. And then a public uproar started. They changed legislation a first time. And then with the next catastrophe, thalidomide in '62, where children were born without limbs, they changed again the legislation, the so-called Kefauver-Harris amendments. And that was the birth of modern labels. So if people talk about off-label use, they don't mean just something that is not printed on the label. They mean modern labels which have been approved by a regulatory authority. And whatever you claim in this label, you cannot just invent it. You have to prove it by clinical trials. And when that was introduced in '62, most pharmaceutical companies simply wrote into their package insert, not investigated in children. These were the so-called pediatric disclaimers. And pediatricians protested against it. And for decades, little happened. Now there is one more element we have to be aware of. Drugs used to be developed in 1910, 1920 also by academic people. In the meantime, drug development has become so complex that it is no longer developed by academia. It's pharmaceutical companies. Academic people can start a company, biotech people do that, researchers do that. They can start the company, they can develop up to a certain point, then usually either they grow and find people who have experience from industry, or they sell it to industry. So labels control what pharmaceutical companies do, And the clinical trial is a test if what the originator thinks the drug is able to do will really do. In this system, children were lost to some degree. A lot of medication was developed for children, but over the decades, we have a gap developed because modern pharmaceutical treatment is very potent. And it was seen that the attention of this development was adults, not children, because in adults you can earn more money. And so the regulatory authorities reflected, and the first step that really changed something was in 1997 with the introduction of BPCA, Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act, here. It was within an overall law called FDAMA, FDA Modernization Act. And it offered a reward for pediatric research. Later came a second legislation, PREA, Pediatric Research Equity Act, which is also called the stick, while the reward is called the carrot. These legislation had to be renewed, reauthorized every 5 years in the beginning, and it was only now, this year, that they were renewed and reauthorized forever under the name of FDASIA, FDA Safety and Innovation Act. Both legislation triggered a lot of pediatric research. And again, the reason for that is that drugs are developed by companies privately, and companies follow their logic, which is financial. So to get them to look into children, it was necessary to introduce pressure from the outside of their own logic, and only governments can do that. So we have a European pediatric regulation since 2007. It is comparable to the US legislation, but the emphasis is on the stick. There is a reward, but it's very little. So today, companies who want to register a drug in Europe, a new drug, must submit a pediatric investigation plan at the end of human PK. If you don't have it, the EMA, European Medicines Agency, will simply not register your drug. They will not validate your submission. The PIP must cover all age groups from preterm newborn to adolescent. There is a pediatric committee that assesses PIPs, waivers and deferrals. Waiver means no development in children because the disease doesn't exist or other reasons. There are only 3 reasons. The disease doesn't exist, the drug is unsafe, or there is no additional good benefit of the new drug. Deferral means you do it pediatrics later, and you get a reward at the end of patent life. The core elements, again, the core elements is FDA started when the gap I described between therapeutic potential in adults versus treatment in children was perceived as extreme. So clinicians knew that they were using drugs for adults and children, but they had very, very limited knowledge about child physiology. So when the FDA introduced their legislation, they wanted some more pediatric data. The EU wants more. They want a full pediatric indication. And they want that very early. And they expect each company to be extremely knowledgeable also in the field of pediatrics. Their style has developed from beginning to still claiming to be science-driven, but they want something we can discuss if it's possible at all. So some of the things they ask can be perceived as exaggerated. They dictate clinical trials even where clinicians say they don't make sense. And that is a discussion we can discuss for 3 days and 3 nights, and we will not find an agreement. So it's a complex issue. This is what the EU would like to achieve. You have drug development, you have basic research that can come from industry or from academia, and then you decide you have something that might 10 years later be a medication. So you entered into man. The FDA asks you for a pediatric plan here when you register. You are allowed to discuss it earlier with FDA. They encourage that, they want it, but you have to submit here. In the EU, you have to submit the PIP here. And now look what that is. That is proof of concept. So if you have a drug, what you do first is you give it to animals to look what it does to animals. If rats and mice drop dead, probably it's not a good medication. But before you haven't proved it in patients, you don't know if it really works. You hope that it works, but you don't know. Proof of concept is done here. But the EMA wants the PIP here. So many years before you know if the drug works at all. This is challenging. Here is the procedure. It starts 3 months earlier. It starts here. You send a letter of intent 2 months before you submit. You submit here. And once you have submitted at given deadlines, the EMA first has to validate your PIP. If they find mistakes or what they think is mistakes, they send it back. You have to correct the so-called errors. But if it's validated, then it's discussed then it's distributed within the pediatric committee. The procedure is 2 core blocks of 60 days. Block 1, block 2, and day 1, they distribute it internally. By the way, it has already been distributed because you have to send it to each PDCO member as a CD-ROM and as an email anyway. But administratively, they distribute it here. They discuss it a first time, a second time. They give you a preliminary opinion. You have to discuss that in the company, so they usually ask for more. Clock stop usually is 3 months. Then the second block starts again. Distribution, next discussion, final discussion. And as with all committees, they emphasize they want the dialogue with you. And the dialogue is here, the last day of the procedure. It's called oral explanation. And that is what companies are expected to do. So look how the drug might be used in children in the future. This is the structure of the PIP. So you have to cover basic information about the company, and then the key issues is technical development, they call it quality, CMC, non-clinical aspects, juvenile animals, clinical aspects, so what trials do you propose and when you plan that. And this is how the oral explanation works. Remember, last day of the procedure, or last 3 days of the procedure, you have a nice cozy room that spans about 15 meters. So it's about from that side of the room maybe to here or a few meters more. And you have the pediatric committee members sitting here. They don't look at you, they look at their screens. You as industry talk to the chairman, and if you are lucky, the pediatric committee members will listen to you. And if you are less lucky, they will read emails, play with a BlackBerry, or will sleep, or whatever they do. So, but they have the power to decide. A few examples. Nycomed, a company that does no longer exist, requested a full waiver for a diagnostic agent for coronary artery disease, a disease that does not exist in children. But there are other diseases in children, cardiac diseases. So the EMA redefined the condition as visualization of myocardial perfusion for diagnostic purposes. myocardial perfusion deficits do exist in children. So the PETCO recommended a clinical program in pediatric cardiology. NICOMED didn't think it was necessary, so they got a negative opinion. NICOMED took EMA to the European Court of Justice, and the European Court of Justice 2 times backed the EMA. So I will not go into depth, but the one thing you must understand is we have so far 2 decisions from the highest European court that say a company must do what the EMA tells them, and if it would be too easy to just find a way to go around, it would take away their obligation to develop drugs in children. So, if you are interested, you will get this presentation, or you send me an email, I send it to you, and you can look at both EU Court of Justice decisions on the internet. Here are the links. And the consequence of that is that now companies know that the hurdle to convince EMA or even to get a court backing the company against the EMA is very difficult. Eventually this will happen. Eventually EMA will exaggerate and the company will sue and get the backing of the judge. But it is not easy, and that's why I tell you about it. Here are the Court of Justice decisions. Now, here a few more examples about decisions of the Pediatric Committee. Key elements are published. You can find them on the EMA Pediatric website. Details are confidential, but key elements are public. And I will give you 6 examples: melanoma, joint injuries, vaccines, drugs for preterm newborns, drugs developed only for children, and rare diseases. Melanoma is very, very rare in children. It exists. This is the official reasoning of the Pediatric Committee. They say that in an American statistic, 1.7 in 100,000 15 to 19 years olds develop melanoma. There is a main difference between child and adult melanoma. When it's detected in adults, in most cases, it's already metastasized. In children, in most cases, it is not. You cut it out, and that's it. You need treatment only if it's metastasized. So if we have, let me say, 10% of children with metastasized melanoma, it's no longer 1.7 in 100,000, but 1.7 in a million. And then you have this strange number, 15 to 19 years old. So there are 2 age groups that are above 18 and 3 that are below. You are a child in the legal sense of the word, only between 15 and 17. But they take this statistic because it doesn't differentiate between 15 and 18 years old, and they say it's 1.7 in 15 to 19 years old. So you have to deduce 2/5 of this number. So now you have already only around 0.9 in a million. That is a very rare disease. So probably this type of melanoma patient, adolescent melanoma patient, you have, if you estimate 10 million Greek people, you will have this disease, this population, maybe 10 patients or probably 9 patients in Greece per year. That's a difficult population to recruit. We have today 6 melanoma PIPs, and to give you one example, is Yervoy ipilimumab. The PETCO asked for several trials. This was also for other cancer diseases, but this is for melanoma, open label, multicenter, single-arm IV, in patients with advanced metastatic melanoma previously treated or not treated. And another study, open label randomized, active control study, ipilimumab versus interferon in patients with resected high-risk melanoma. So this company has now to seek for the 9 Greek children or adolescents with advanced metastasized melanoma, or the 20 that may exist in Germany, or maybe there is one in Malta, maybe there's one more in Cyprus. My question is, a comparison with these low case numbers, what will it show us? And my answer is it will show us nothing. Because you need a statistical significance. You reach statistical significance in adults because you have much higher case numbers. There are 60,000 melanomas in Europe per year and another 60,000 in the US. So companies, if they say no, they cannot register the drug. What can they do? They will try hard to find these patients. If they don't find them, they can ask for modification of the PIP. But the other consequence is that the PETCO blocks melanoma patients for the next 10 years or so for developments that have started 5 years earlier. So it is now a regulatory authority that decides about clinical treatment. And that is not right, because they are not the specialists in pediatric oncology. That's the reason why pediatric oncology exists. Somebody who spends all his life in pediatric oncology knows a little bit more than an agency employee who maybe 2 hours a year reads an article about pediatric oncology. But this is Europe today. So here a few estimates about the societal impact of the legislation. It increases the cost of drug development. For large companies, this is still doable. It can be different for small companies. It can kill them. There is an SME, which stands for Small and Medium Enterprises at the EMA, but the Pediatric Committee treats all companies equal. The higher costs for pediatric medicines have not yet reached calculations of insurers and reimbursement institutions. It takes decision power away from companies. Clinicians still have often a good opinion, but once they have been involved in the discussion with the pediatric committee, they change the opinion. And the outcome of this exercise is difficult to assess because everything is confidential. So I can only work with the data that are published on the EMA website. 2 revisions will happen in the next years, one next year in 2013, another one in 2018. This is what the EMA describes, that work is well advanced to promote less detailed PIP proposals, etc. So the EMA accepts that in the past they wanted too many details. Companies invested hundreds of thousands of working hours in do that. Now we see that it doesn't make sense. We had a conference in September in London to discuss this. So on one side, they will make the PIPs less detailed. On the other side, it was published a few days ago that now they plan to do in other pediatric cancers what they did already in melanoma. They revoked the original class waiver in melanoma. So they will ask for a pediatric program even in more rare pediatric cancer types. So question, will a reasonable modification of the regulation happen in 2018? And my answer is there will be very contradictory proposals. Industry will ask for one thing, clinicians will ask for a second thing, regulatory authorities will ask for more power, that is already clear. So I think this regulation will stay. It will give me a good job for the next years. The question is, what sense does it make? There is one definitely positive element, and that is drug development is no longer possible without considering children. It increases costs. What you find when you deal with this agency and this committee is a mosaic of goodwill, of science, of bureaucracy that is no longer controlled, industry forced to use disproportionate resources, a very limited clinical benefit, and people on the other side of the discussion table who have limited scientific understanding, but a lot of power, and they use that power. To deal with the PIPs and the pediatric committee, you need an intimate knowledge of their bureaucracy, of the people, of their things they do. If you want to save money in the PIP process, you need to discuss it early. Once you have started negotiation towards the end, it's very difficult to change things. Companies, as individual companies, have to negotiate a PIP that hopefully will serve child health many years later and lets the company survive. If we remember what in Lisbon was said in 2000, they wanted Europe to become the most competitive and dynamic knowledge-based economy in the world. And if we look how Europe stands today, I would say that aim was not reached. So we should see the pediatric legislation in Europe in this framework. It's one of many European challenges. Just to have a good intention doesn't mean that you do good things. But on the other side, this legislation will stay, and there is no alternative than to live with it and continue with the dialogue. And that's it. Thank you for your attention.